The first thing I noticed was Calder's voice, sharp, controlled, like he'd practiced. "We know you took the 30,000 Oravel." I stood at the kitchen counter, my hand still resting on the handle of the kettle I'd just set down. Sapphira was beside him, arms folded tight, eyes fixed on me as if she were staring at a stranger. Calder slid a printed sheet across the counter. The bank logo was unmistakable, the numbers circled in red. "That's from your account," he said. "Transferred into an account you didn't tell us about." I didn't even sit before answering. "I don't have another account." "Someone has." "Stop, Sapphira," cut in her voice cold enough to silence me. "It's all there. Why are you lying?" My mouth went dry. 30 years of being her mother, of working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, of doing everything alone after her father passed, and now she wouldn't even let me finish a sentence. Calder stepped closer, the faint scent of his aftershave catching in my throat. "We just need you to admit it," he said, softening his tone like I was a child caught with her hand in the jar. "It's the only way this can be resolved, peacefully." The absurdity of that word peacefully made my knees weak. I had no idea how he'd gotten that statement, no idea whose account that was. But the certainty in his voice was enough to pull Sapphira to his side completely. "Pack a bag," she said without looking at me. "You need to leave. Tonight." It didn't feel real. The evening light was streaming through the kitchen window the same way it always did, but everything else was foreign. I walked to my bedroom in slow steps, pulling a small suitcase from the closet. My fingers brushed over the framed photo of Sapphira at her college graduation flowers I'd arranged in her hands. I left it on the dresser. 20 minutes later, I was on the porch with a single suitcase, the door closing firmly behind me. And just like that, I was no longer welcome in my own home. I sat on the low wooden step, the cool air pressing against my cheeks. The street was quiet, except for the occasional hum of a passing car. My suitcase leaned against my leg, its handle still warm from my grip. I didn't know where to go. The thought of calling anyone felt impossible, but as the hours stretched, I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Most names were distant acquaintances or people tied to Sapphira in some way. Finally, I stopped at Maris, a friend from years back who had stood beside me after my husband died. My thumb hovered over the call button, but pride was heavier than loneliness. I couldn't show up on her doorstep with nothing but accusations hanging over my head. By midnight, I checked into the cheapest motel I could find within walking distance. The room smelled faintly of stale air, and the bedspread was patterned with faded roses. I sat at the edge of the mattress and stared at the peeling wallpaper until my eyes blurred. Every sacrifice I'd made for Sapphira replayed in my mind, the nights I came home from cleaning offices too tired to eat, the necklace I sold to cover her first semester tuition, the birthdays where I gave her what little I could afford, but made sure it was wrapped in ribbons she liked. I told myself I wouldn't cry, but sometime after 2 a.m, my face was wet and my chest ached. I turned onto my side, clutching the pillow as though it could anchor me. Sleep was shallow, full of jagged dreams where Sapphira's voice kept saying, "Why are you lying?" At sunrise, the light creeping through the thin curtains pushed me upright. I checked my phone again. No messages, no calls. My balance in the bank app was just enough for a few days if I was careful. I couldn't live like this, adrift and waiting for someone to believe me. I zipped my suitcase, stepped out into the morning air, and decided I would find work before the day ended. The sidewalks were still damp from the early sprinklers when I started walking. I passed storefronts waking for the day, metal gates sliding open, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds. My suitcase wheels caught on the uneven pavement, but I kept moving, scanning windows for any sign of work. It was a small, hand-painted sign that stopped me. "Help wanted. Inquire within." It hung in the window of a narrow flower shop, wedged between a laundromat and a stationery store. The display was simple glass vases, lined with stems in soft, muted tones. Something in me pulled toward the door. Inside, the scent of fresh blooms was immediate, a reminder of a life I thought I'd left behind. A woman in her late 50s looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked. I nodded toward the sign. "I'm here about the job." Her name was Marceline Hoyt, and she owned the place. She studied me with a mix of curiosity and caution, as I explained I had experience in floral design, though I left out the years of events I'd done for Sapphira's milestones. After a pause, she said, "It's part-time. Pay isn't much, but there's a small room upstairs you can use if you need somewhere to stay." The relief was almost too sharp to hide. That would be perfect. By afternoon, I was sweeping the shop floor and trimming stems at a side table. The rhythm of it steadied me snip-sort place. Near closing, a young woman came in, asking for a bouquet for her wedding rehearsal. Marceline began assembling it, but when she stepped away to answer the phone, I adjusted the arrangement, weaving in smaller blooms to soften the edges. When the bride returned to the counter, her eyes widened. "This is beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers lightly over the petals. Marceline glanced at me, her expression unreadable, and rang up the sale. That night, I climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the shop, the hum of the laundromat below fading into a quiet that felt for the first time in days almost safe. Within weeks, I'd settled into the shop's steady rhythm morning deliveries, from the market stems sorted into buckets, the counter filling with the scent of fresh blooms. Marceline kept me mostly at the register and on cleanup, but now and then, she'd ask me to finish a bouquet if she was busy. Each time I tried to leave a little of myself in the work, an unexpected pairing of colors, a sprig of something fragrant, tucked where it would surprise. It was subtle at first. A woman picking up flowers for her mother's birthday stopped to ask who had arranged them. Then a couple planning an anniversary dinner came back the next week, specifically asking for me. Marceline didn't say much, but I noticed she began leaving me alone with more of the orders. One Saturday, a small wedding party came in. They'd been let down by another florist and were desperate for something to brighten the reception. Marceline hesitated. Large, last-minute requests were risky, but I told her I could handle it. Hours later, I stood back from the finished arrangements, table centerpieces spilling with cascading greens, tall vases of blush and cream blooms catching the light. The bridal party's reaction was all the thanks I needed. Their faces softened, voices hushed, as if they were looking at something more than flowers. Photos started appearing on social media tagged to the shop. Orders grew, and so did my hours. Marceline began to trust me with sourcing, letting me walk the stalls at the market and choose the best stems. I found myself waking earlier, eager for the work, my hands remembering shapes and textures like old friends. One evening, as I was closing up, Marceline stood in the doorway with a cup of water in hand. "You've brought something special here," she said, her tone more thoughtful than I'd ever heard it. I didn't answer, but a quiet pride warmed my chest. I locked the shop, the city lights winking to life outside, and wondered just how far these flowers could take me. It was a Tuesday morning when the shop's phone rang, and Marceline's eyes flicked toward me. "For you," she said, holding out the receiver, like she wasn't quite sure what to make of it. The voice on the other end was smooth, deliberate. "Orville Drennan. My name is Jareth Lacombe. I'm a wedding planner, and I saw your work at the Stoddard reception last weekend. I'd like to meet." I'd learned not to react too quickly, but my fingers tightened around the phone. We arranged to meet at the shop the next afternoon. When he arrived, he was impeccably dressed, his gaze sweeping over the arrangements on the counter before settling on me. "I'm organizing a high-profile wedding next month," he said, pulling out a folder. "The bride wants florals that feel alive, something guests will remember." He slid a photo toward me. "I think you're the one to create them." The scope of it was daunting, an outdoor estate ceremony, hundreds of guests, every detail photographed and published. Part of me wanted to refuse. Attention on that scale could draw eyes I didn't want. But another part of me, the part still smarting from being shoved out of my own home, refused to shrink back. "I can do it," I said, my voice steady. The next weeks were a blur of early market runs, sketches, and trial arrangements. I worked after hours in the shop's back room, petals littering the floor, my hands aching in the best possible way. Marceline peeked in, once a rare smile crossing her face. When the wedding day came, I arrived before sunrise. By the time guests began arriving, the ceremony space was transformed. Arches layered with roses and trailing vines, tables lined with blooms that seemed to breathe. I kept to the side watching as people slowed their eyes, catching on details I'd agonized over. 2 days later, glossy photos appeared in a society magazine crediting Aurivel Drennan floral designer. I stared at my name in print, my heartbeat steady not from nerves, but from the sense that something much larger had just begun. After the magazine spread, the calls began. At first, it was 1 or 2 a week, an engagement party here, a charity dinner there. Then came the larger inquiries, corporate galas, high-end fundraisers, weddings planned a year in advance. Jareth sent more than a few my way, and each time the scale grew. Marceline adapted quickly, ordering more stock, expanding the workspace in the back to accommodate my designs. She never said it outright, but I could feel her pride in the way she introduced me to clients. "This is Aurivel, the reason people are talking about us." The work was relentless, but I thrived on it. I learned to negotiate contracts, to budget for blooms that would arrive fresh even in the dead of winter. My designs began to carry a signature, lush, layered textures, unexpected combinations that drew the eye and held it. Event photographers started requesting close-ups of the arrangements, and my name found its way into captions more often. By the end of the first year, I had enough saved to rent a small penthouse studio near the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled it with light, and I set up a long work table where I could prepare commissions privately. I kept the arrangement with Marceline still working out of her shop when local clients called, but more often now, I traveled New York, Chicago, even a governor's gala in Boston. Through it all, I heard nothing from Sapphira. Not a text, not a call, not a word. At first, that silence had stung like an open wound, but over time, it became a quiet space. I learned to live within. I told myself I didn't need closure. I told myself I'd built something better. Still, on certain evenings, when the work table was cleared and the city lights shimmered below my windows, I would catch myself wondering what she thought, if she even knew where I was or what I'd made of the life she'd thrown away for me. And then, one late autumn night, a sound came that I hadn't heard in years, a timid knock that seemed to echo all the way through me. I almost didn't answer. The knock was so soft it could have been the wind shifting something against the building. But it came again, 3 short taps, hesitant, uneven. I set down the shears I'd been using to trim stems and made my way to the back entrance. When I opened the door, Sapphira was standing there. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Her hair was tangled, her coat torn at the sleeve, and her face bore a fading bruise along the cheekbone. She clutched a worn handbag to her chest, as though it might be the only thing she owned. "Aurivel," her voice broke on my name, and then she shook her head. "Mom." I didn't know where else to go. I stepped aside. She slipped past me into the warm air of the studio, her shoulders trembling. We stood in silence for a beat before she sank into the nearest chair. The smell of rain clung to her clothes. "It was Calder," she said finally, her eyes fixed on the floor. He hit me, more than once. And then, he emptied our accounts. Every cent." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "It was him, Mom. The 30,000. He made it look like you did it. He wanted you gone so he could get control of everything. I felt the words settle into me like cold water, not shocking, just heavy. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm so sorry. I believed him. I didn't even give you a chance. I stayed still, letting her confession hang between us. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the cooler in the corner. I don't have anywhere else, she whispered. I don't even know if he's looking for me right now. Her voice was raw, stripped of the certainty I remembered. I pulled out the chair opposite hers and sat down, meeting her eyes. You're safe here, I said slowly, the words tasting of both truth and caution. But we need to be clear about how this goes. Sapphira stared at me, her eyes wide, as though she wasn't sure if she'd heard me right. I pulled my chair in closer, resting my hands on the table between us. You can stay, I said, keeping my tone even, but it won't be like before. You'll need to work. You'll need to follow my lead. She nodded quickly. Too quickly. The desperation in her movements making my stomach tighten. I'll do anything, Mom, I swear. I need to get back on my feet. I studied her face, searching for the same girl I used to know. Beneath the exhaustion and the bruises, there was still a flicker of that restless determination she'd always had, only now it was bent by fear. Then the first thing we do is make sure Calder can't hurt you again, I said. And that means we don't just hide. We take back what's ours. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean I didn't answer right away? Instead, I stood cross to my desk and pulled out a small notebook where I kept my private contacts, planners, suppliers, attorneys. My finger paused on one name, Marcus Dre, a lawyer I'd met at a charity gala. He'd once told me, half joking, that if I ever needed a quiet problem, handled he was the one to call. I said, looking back at her, that we make sure Calder has nothing left to run with. For the next hour, I asked her questions, dates, account numbers, anything she could remember. At first her answers were hesitant, but soon they came faster, as though the act of speaking about it gave her back a measure of control. I wrote everything down. When she finally leaned back, drained, I closed the notebook. Get some rest, I told her. Tomorrow we start. I watched her walk toward the small guest room at the back of the studio, the door clicking shut behind her. Then I reached for my phone, scrolling, until I found Marcus's number and pressed call. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice calm and clipped. I explained everything: Calder's theft, the forged transfer, the assault. He didn't interrupt, only asked pointed questions, each one narrowing the scope like he was tightening a cord. When I finished, there was a pause. I can work with this, he said, but I'll need access to her statements, any messages, anything that ties him to the accounts. By mid-morning, Sapphira and I were seated side by side at my work table, sorting through her phone, old emails, and the few printed bank statements she still had. She flinched every time Calder's name appeared on the screen, but she kept going. I guided her through each step, keeping her focused on the outcome, not the memories. Marcus called again that afternoon. I've got a contact in financial crimes who owes me a favor. If we move fast, we can freeze his assets before he shifts them again. That evening, we met with him in a quiet office above a law library. Sapphira signed forms with a shaky hand, while Marcus laid out the strategy: a freeze order on joint account subpoenas for transfer records, and a civil suit to recover the stolen 30,000 plus damages. Back at the studio, I could see the exhaustion in her face. But there was something else to relief. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't running. Over the next week, I balanced my work on upcoming events with quiet calls to Marcus and updates from his investigator. Each piece of information felt like another thread in the net we were weaving. We traced Calder's spending to a handful of luxury purchases and a down payment on a waterfront rental under a false name. When Marcus sent me the final message, "Everything's in place. He won't see it coming," I read it twice before sliding my phone into my pocket. The next step wasn't about Flowers' contracts or events. It was about ending something that should have been stopped 2 years ago. Marcus timed it perfectly. Calder was in the middle of closing a deal on another rental property when the freeze order hit. Every account locked. Every credit line suspended. By the time his lawyer called him, the civil suit had already been filed and the subpoena for the stolen $30,000 was waiting on his desk. I didn't need to be there to see his reaction. Marcus's grin over the phone told me enough. "He's rattled," he said, "and the press will have the filings by morning." Sapphira was standing by the window when I hung up. I told her the essentials. Calder couldn't touch a cent, the authorities were circling, and the money was on its way back. She closed her eyes, a shudder passing through her before she opened them again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice uneven. I didn't tell her everything that Marcus had arranged for a quiet settlement that would ensure Calder never came near her again. Some protections don't need to be spoken to be understood. 2 weeks later, the transfer posted. The stolen $30,000 plus interest sat in a separate account under Sapphira's name, guarded by legal stipulations that Calder couldn't touch. She chose to use part of it for a small apartment across town, a place she could make her own without fear. The night she moved out, she hugged me longer than I expected. "I don't deserve your help," she said. I met her eyes. "Maybe not. But I wasn't about to let him destroy you." After she left, I stood in the quiet studio, the faint scent of fresh blooms drifting from the work table. The phone buzzed, a new inquiry for an event, another opportunity to keep building the life I'd fought for. I saved the details, turned back to the flowers waiting for me, and let the hum of the cooler and the steady rhythm of my work fill the room. This was my space now, my life, and I intended to keep it that way.